The morning Ira Trask walked through the front door of the Marshal's office with his hands raised and his guns on the ground behind him. Not a single soul in Caldwell, Kansas believed it had anything to do with his conscience. It was the autumn of 1878, and Caldwell sat on the edge of the Kishom Trail like a coin balanced on a fence post, liable to fall either way, into lawfulness or into ruin. The cattle drives had been rolling through for years, bringing with them money and whiskey and trouble in equal measure. The town had grown fast and loud and raw, the way frontier towns always did, slapped together with fresh lumber and ambition, and just enough law to keep things from going completely sideways. Marshal Dent Holloway had been the man holding that particular line for 3 years, and he was a good enough man, tired and fair and sharp enough to know when something didn't add up. What didn't add up was Ira Trask standing in his doorway on a Tuesday morning with the October light cutting gold through the dust behind him. Ira Trask was 32 years old, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that had gone a little long and a jaw that looked like it had been chiseled out of sandstone. He'd spent the better part of the last decade riding with a loose outfit called the Danner Gang, not because he was born mean, but because he'd been 17 and hungry and Chester Danner had offered him a horse and 3 meals a day, and that had seemed like enough reason at the time. He hadn't killed anyone. That was the thing people in Caldwell would argue about later, in the saloon and over the back fences and in the pews on Sunday morning. Ira Trask had ridden with outlaws for 15 years, but his hands were clean of blood, and everyone who knew anything about his history knew it. He'd been muscle, mostly. A presence. A man who looked dangerous enough that other men thought twice. He'd held horses and kept watch and once, memorably, talked Chester Danner out of shooting a bank clerk in Wichita by pointing out that the clerk was 16 years old and the son of the town judge, which would have brought a kind of heat down on them that no amount of stolen money was worth. He'd parted ways with the Danner outfit 8 months prior, following a job in Dodge City that went crooked enough to leave 2 men dead who weren't supposed to be. Neither of those men was killed by Ira, but he'd been there, and he'd watched, and something in him had curdled and gone bad in that moment. He'd ridden south and east and ended up in Caldwell in the early spring, and he'd taken work at the Hennessy livery stable, and he'd kept his head down and his mouth shut, and for 8 months he had been nothing more than a quiet man who smelled like horses and paid his rent on time. Then Georgia Shepard arrived in town. She came in on the eastbound stage in late August, and the whole town noticed her, because the whole town noticed everything, and because she was the kind of woman who drew eyes without meaning to. She was 28 years old, with dark red hair that she wore pinned up with a practical severity that didn't quite succeed at making her look severe. She had green eyes that saw things quickly and 2 little girls at her skirts, Clara, who was 6 and solemn, and me, who was 4 and absolutely not solemn about anything. Georgia Shepard was a widow, as the whole of Caldwell learned within approximately 4 hours of her arrival, because Mrs. Adelia Bright, who ran the boarding house, asked her directly, the way older frontier women did, without apology and without particular cruelty. It was simply information the town needed to organize itself around. George's husband had been a man named Tobias Shepard, a farmer from a stretch of land up near Ellsworth who had died of a fever the previous spring, leaving Georgia with 2 daughters, a mortgaged plot of land she couldn't afford to work alone, and a sister in Caldwell named Ruth Colley who had written to tell her to come south and start fresh. So Georgia had sold what she could, packed what she could carry, and come south on the stage with her girls and a trunk and a stubbornness about her that you could see in the set of her shoulders if you knew what to look for. Ira Trask did not think much about Georgia Shepard at first. He was not the sort of man who thought much about anything except getting through the day quietly and not drawing attention to himself. He saw her at the general store once in the first week, her younger girl me pulling at her skirt, while she counted coins in her palm with a focused expression that told him the counting mattered. He saw her again at the church social in September, standing to one side with a cup of lemonade and watching her girls run with the other children in the churchyard with an expression of such pure, unguarded love that it stopped him in his tracks for a moment before he made himself look away. He was not a man who deserved to look at things like that. That was what he told himself. A man with his history didn't get to stand in churchyards and feel tender about other people's love. He went home and tended to the horses and went to sleep and did not think about Georgia Shepard. He thought about Georgia Shepard. It was a Tuesday in late September when the thing happened that changed everything. Ira was coming out of the dry goods store with a paper sack of oats when he saw Georgia Shepard on the opposite side of the street, and he saw, at the same moment, the two men who were following her. He knew their type immediately, the way a man who has lived on the wrong side of the law for 15 years learns to know it. They were Danner men. Not Chester Danner himself, who was a man of particular cowardice and would never expose himself to something so direct, but two of his riders, a squat red-faced man named Purdy and a taller, quieter man named Cole, who was the more dangerous of the two. They weren't following Georgia for any particular reason that had to do with her. They were following her because she had bumped into Cole in front of the saloon 20 minutes earlier, and Cole had said something ugly, and Georgia had told him, in a clear and level voice, to mind himself, and that had been enough. Men like Cole were the kind who couldn't let a thing like that go. Ira crossed the street without deciding to. He stepped in front of Cole and Purdy with the paper sack of oats under his arm, and he didn't say anything dramatic or make any particular show of himself. He just stood there and let them see his face and let the recognition work through them, because they knew him, or at least they knew what he'd been, and what he'd been was something that made men like Cole and Purdy recalculate their plans. "Trask," Cole said, and there was a flatness in his voice that was half recognition and half resentment. "You two are going the wrong way," Ira said. His voice was quiet, it always was. It carried better that way. Cole looked past him to where Georgia had stopped and turned, watching with wide eyes. Her hand was on Clara's shoulder, and she'd pulled me against her side. "This doesn't concern you," Cole said. "Now it does," Ira said. It was not a long standoff. Cole was dangerous, but he was also practical, and there was something in Ira's stillness that gave even practical men pause. Purdy was already shifting his weight backward, which told Ira everything he needed to know about how this was going to resolve. After a long moment, Cole turned and walked away, and Purdy went with him, and the street went back to its ordinary noise. Ira turned around. Georgia Shepard was looking at him with those green eyes, and he had the uncomfortable experience of being seen, really seen, which was something he had been avoiding for most of his adult life. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was steady. She was the kind of woman who didn't shake until later when she was alone, and he somehow knew that about her immediately. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He looked down at Clara, who was regarding him with the same serious attention her mother was. And then at me, who had her face half hidden against Georgia's skirt but was peering out at him with enormous brown eyes. "Are you the man from the livery?" Georgia asked. He was surprised that she knew that. "Yes, ma'am, Ira Trask." "Georgia Shepard," she said, and put her hand out the way a person does when they mean it. He shifted the oat sack and shook it. Her grip was firm and brief and warm. "Those men," she said after a moment. "Should I be worried about them?" He considered lying to make her feel better and decided against it. "I'll have a word with someone," he said, which was as close to a promise as he was prepared to make. He had that word, as it turned out, not with someone but with Marshal Holloway himself, who was already aware that two of Danner's men were in town and was not particularly happy about it. Holloway ran them out that same evening, and it was done quietly and without incident. And Georgia Shepard probably never knew the full extent of it, though her sister Ruth told her something of it later. But here was what happened in between the moment of Georgia's "thank you" and the moment Ira turned himself in to the Marshal. 6 weeks of Caldwell autumn. 6 weeks of a man who had been living at arm's length from the rest of the human world, discovering that the distance was collapsing. It began with me. Me was 4 years old and had no instincts whatsoever about appropriate social caution. 3 days after the incident on the street, she escaped her mother's attention at the Saturday market and found her way to the livery stable, where she stood in the wide doorway looking in at the horses, with a reverence that would have been touching even if she hadn't also been completely alone and clearly lost. Ira found her there when he came in from the paddock with a lead rope over his shoulder. She looked up at him with total composure and said, "I want to see the horses. Does your mother know where you are?" He asked. "No," me said with perfect honesty. He took her back to Georgia before he showed her the horses, because that was the right thing to do, and Georgia's expression when she saw me safe at the hand of this large, quiet man was something that moved through him like a warm wind. She dropped to her knees right there on the dusty street and held her daughter and looked up at Ira over me's head and said, "I am so sorry," and he said, "She wasn't any trouble," and that was true, though it was also the beginning of something. Because Georgia looked mortified and grateful, and a little undone in the way of a woman who is managing everything alone and sometimes finds that everything is a great deal to manage. And Ira Trask, who had spent 15 years being deliberately unaware of other people's inner lives, was suddenly and entirely aware of hers. He asked, before he thought better of it, whether me might like to see the horses now, with her mother present. And Georgia, who had clearly expected him to simply walk away, blinked and then looked at me's face, and me's face said everything necessary, and so the three of them went back to the livery. He showed them a chestnut mare named Dolly who was the gentlest horse in the stable, and who let me put her small hands on her nose with a patience that seemed almost deliberate. Clara hung back at first, which told him she was the more cautious of the two, and he didn't push, just let her watch, and eventually curiosity won out, and she came forward and touched Dolly's cheek with one finger, the way a child touches something they're not sure is real. Georgia stood back from all of this with her arms crossed over her chest and a look on her face that was warm and watching and careful all at once. And when he glanced at her, she didn't look away, and he did. "You're good with them," she said when the girls were occupied. "I'm better with horses," he said, which made her laugh. It was a real laugh, short and genuine, and it hit him somewhere in the chest where he was not prepared for it. After that it was simply things, ordinary things, the kind that accumulate meaning only when you're standing inside them. He saw her at the market and touched his hat. He saw her at the church social in October and stood near her long enough to have a conversation about whether Caldwell was going to get a proper schoolhouse before winter. The town was debating it. Ruth Colley said it was inevitable. Georgia said the children couldn't wait for inevitable. They needed it now. And she had a particular quality in her voice when she said it that told him she was already thinking about how to make it happen herself. He saw Clara sitting on the steps of the boarding house one afternoon with a book in her lap, reading with that same solemn concentration she turned on everything, and he stopped and said, "That a good one?" And Clara looked up and considered him and said, "It's about a girl who lives on a lighthouse," and he said, "Does she like it?" And Clara said, "She does, but she's also a little lonely," and he said, "That makes sense." And Clara looked at him for a moment and then went back to her book, and he went on his way feeling like he'd passed some kind of exam. Me, meanwhile, had decided he was her particular friend and informed him of this directly. She appeared at the livery stable at intervals that were irregular enough to keep him from predicting them, but frequent enough to keep him from forgetting about her. She brought him things: a smooth river stone, a blue feather, a small picture she'd drawn that appeared to be a horse but might have been a dog. He kept all of them on the shelf above his bunk in the back room of the stable and did not examine too closely what that meant about him. Georgia came with her sometimes, and occasionally Georgia came alone, which was different, and they both knew it was different. She came on a Wednesday afternoon in the middle of October, ostensibly to ask him about a horse for hire, because she needed to get out to her sister's husband's property to help with something, and it was too far to walk with the girls. But they talked for an hour in the cool shadow of the stable doorway, and the horse for hire was mentioned only briefly, and everything else was mentioned at length, including where she'd grown up, which was Missouri, and what Tobias had been like, which she talked about with a clear-eyed honesty that told him she was past the stage of grief where you had to make the dead into saints. Tobias had been a decent man and a hard worker, and she had loved him and she still missed him, and she was also making peace with the fact that she had to build something new now, because she had two girls who were counting on her, and that was the most important thing she knew how to say about her present life. "What about you?" she said, and looked at him directly in that way she had that always caught him slightly off balance. "What brought you to Caldwell?" He was quiet for a moment. He was not going to lie to her. He had already decided at some point without knowing when he decided it that he was not going to lie to her, but the truth was complicated and he wasn't sure how much of it to offer at once. "I used to ride with a rough outfit," he said, watching her face. "Not anymore. I came here to be something different." She held his gaze. "What kind of rough outfit?" "The Danner gang," he said. He let her have a moment with that. Most people in Kansas knew the name. Her expression changed, but it didn't do what he expected, which was close off. It went thoughtful instead. "Those men," she said slowly, "the ones on the street, they were Danner men." "Yes," he said, "and you knew them." "Yes." She was quiet for a bit, watching the dust in the street outside. "Are you done with all of that?" "I have been for 8 months," he said. "I intend to stay done." She looked at him again. "I believe you," she said, and it was said simply, without drama, the way she said most things, which gave it more weight than if she'd made a production of it. He didn't know what to do with being believed. It had been a long time since anyone had simply believed him about anything. She hired the horse and went out to Ruth's and came back in the early evening with the girls asleep in the saddle in front of her, which meant he had to help her get them down. Clara first and then me. And he carried me through the twilight to the boarding house while Georgia carried Clara. And me was deeply and completely unconscious in his arms the way only small children can be, boneless and trusting and warm. And he thought he was probably not going to recover from this particular walk. And he was right. That was the Wednesday. The turning into the Marshal happened that Friday, and there were 2 days between them that felt important, and also nothing much happened in them outwardly, except that he made up his mind. What happened was this. A man came into the livery stable on Thursday evening, and his name was Roy Purdy, the squat, red-faced man who'd been with Cole on the street. He had not been run out of town permanently, as it turned out, only persuaded to keep a lower profile, and he had come specifically to find Ira Trask. He sat down on a hay bale and folded his hands and said that Chester Danner knew Ira was in Caldwell, and that Chester was not pleased, given that Ira had certain knowledge about certain jobs that Chester would prefer stayed private, and that Chester was sending a message to the effect that Ira should make himself scarce or Chester would make things uncomfortable for him. "What kind of uncomfortable?" Ira asked. Purdy shrugged in the elaborate way of a man who knows exactly what he means but wants deniability. "Chester knows people who know the law," he said. "Chester could arrange for certain information to reach certain ears, put you inside a cell for things you've been connected to, even if you weren't the one doing them." Ira was quiet for a moment. He looked at Purdy without any particular expression. "Get out of my stable," he said. Purdy got out, but he left the threat behind him, and Ira sat with it in the dark for a long time. Here is what Ira understood. Chester Danner could make good on that threat. There were jobs where Ira had been present and for which the law had incomplete information, and if Chester pointed fingers, Ira would find himself defending things that were difficult to defend even if you were innocent of the worst of them. He'd be arrested, tried, possibly convicted. And all of that was survivable in one sense, because he'd figured for a while that some version of legal reckoning might catch up to him eventually. He'd been making his peace with that possibility. But here was the part he had not counted on. He thought about Georgia Shepard finding out. Not the clean version she already knew, that he'd ridden with a rough outfit. The messy version, the one dragged out in a courtroom with accusation and implication and witnesses who would lie to save their own skins. He thought about her daughters in a town where he'd become a subject of scandal and whispers and pointed fingers. He thought about what it would do to the small, careful things she was building here, her fresh start, her sister's town, her daughters growing up somewhere safe. He thought about Mies River stone on the shelf above his bunk. And then he thought about the fact that if he walked into Marshal Holloway's office himself and told the truth, everything he knew, everything he'd witnessed, everything Chester Danner had ever done, the law would have Chester Danner. And Chester Danner would no longer be a threat to anyone in Caldwell, including Ira, including Georgia. Ira himself would face consequences. Some kind of time, probably. But the truth of what he'd done and not done would be on the record in his own words. And that was different from being dragged in with lies heaped on top of it. He sat in the dark and thought about Georgia saying, "I believe you," and he made up his mind. He was at the marshal's office when it opened at 8 on Friday morning, with his guns on the ground outside the door and his hands up in the air. And Marshal Dent Holloway looked at him for a long moment and then said, "Come inside, Trask. For God's sake, put your hands down." Word traveled through Caldwell the way word always did in small frontier towns, immediately and with considerable embellishment. By midday the whole town knew that Ira Trask from the livery had turned himself in to the marshal, and by mid-afternoon the whole town knew exactly why, which is to say they knew the surface version and the real version and a number of invented versions, all circulating simultaneously. The surface version was that Trask had information about Chester Danner and had come forward voluntarily. The invented versions ranged from him being a federal informant to him having killed someone and gotten religion about it. The real version, the one that passed from Ruth Colley to Adelia Bright, and from Adelia Bright to half the women in town by supper, was simpler and more human than any of the invented ones, which is why people preferred to discuss it in a tone of surprised tenderness rather than in the tone of gossip. He had done it for the widow with the 2 little girls. Georgia Shepard did not hear this version until Saturday morning, when Ruth came to the boarding house with an expression on her face that was carefully measured and sat down across from Georgia at the breakfast table and told her everything that Ruth knew or suspected, in the way that sisters do, which is to say she told it with both affection and warning braided together. Georgia listened to all of it with her coffee cup held in both hands and her face still. "He turned himself in," she said, when Ruth had finished. "From what Holloway's deputy said, he walked in clean as you please and talked for 3 hours straight. Gave up every job, every man, every piece of information he had. Including things that'll put Chester Danner away for a good long while. And what happens to Ira?" Ruth looked at her with that sister look. "That depends. He was present for things, but the marshal's satisfied he wasn't the one pulling triggers. There's talk of a reduced sentence or none at all, given the cooperation. But Georgia, I'm going to go see him," Georgia said. "That is exactly what I was going to say you should not do," Ruth said. "Then it's good you didn't finish," Georgia said and stood up. She left the girls with Ruth, who made a face but accepted them, and she walked to the marshal's office in the October morning with her hair properly pinned and her best everyday dress, and an expression of perfect composure that was, in fact, absolutely composed over a considerable internal turbulence. Holloway looked up when she came in and said, with a neutrality that told her he'd been expecting someone to come, "Mrs. Shepard." "Marshal," she said. "I'd like to speak to Ira Trask, if that's permitted." Holloway looked at her for a moment. He was a large, weathered man with a mustache that had gone mostly gray, and he had the look of someone who had been dealing with human complications for too long to be surprised by any particular one of them. "He's not in a cell," Holloway said. "He came in voluntarily and he's not under arrest. We're still working out the legal particulars. He's in the back room." Georgia nodded. Holloway gave her a considering look and then stood up and opened the door to the back room and said, "Trask." "You've got a visitor," and stepped away. The back room was small and smelled like wood smoke and old paper. Ira was sitting in a straight-back chair at a small table with a cup of coffee that looked like it had gone cold. He looked up when she came in, and his face did something she had not quite seen it do before. Something went unguarded in it for just a moment before he got it back under control. "Mrs. Shepard," he said, and stood up. "Sit down," she said, and sat down herself in the other chair without waiting to be offered it. He sat. They looked at each other across the small table. "Why did you do it?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the coffee cup, then he looked at her. "I should have come in months ago," he said, "when I first got here. I knew what I'd been part of, and I should have come clean right away, and I didn't because I was scared of it, of what it meant." He paused, and then there were additional reasons. "What additional reasons?" He met her eyes directly, the way he always did. "I didn't want Danner coming after me in a way that dragged Caldwell into it. There are people here I don't want to see troubled." "People," she said. "You," he said, quietly and plainly. "And your girls." Georgia held his gaze for a long moment. The room was very quiet. Through the wall she could hear the ordinary sounds of the street, outside, boots on the boardwalk, a wagon, someone calling a name. "You should know," she said, choosing her words with care, "that I am not a woman who needs to be protected from things." "No," he said, "I know that. But I am also," she continued, "a woman who recognizes when someone has done something decent. And what you did was decent, Ira. Whatever else you did before this was decent." He looked like he'd been handed something he didn't quite know how to hold. She recognized the expression. She had worn it herself after Tobias died, every time someone did something kind and she didn't know where to put the kindness. "What happens now?" she asked. "Legally. Holloway thinks with the cooperation and the nature of my involvement. I was never the principal in anything, never fired on anyone. I'll likely face a fine and possibly some restricted movement for a period. He's wiring the territorial court today. Chester Danner, though," he paused. "Chester will have a much harder time of it." "Good," Georgia said, with a firmness that surprised him into a slight smile. The smile changed his face in a way she hadn't anticipated. She had seen him be serious and watchful and occasionally dry, but she hadn't quite seen him smile like that, as if something had relaxed inside him that had been tightly wounded for a very long time. "Your girls," he said. "They're all right. They're with Ruth," she said. "Me asked me this morning where the horse man was. I told her he was busy." Something moved in his eyes. "Horse man," he repeated. "She's been calling you that since the livery," Georgia said. "I've been trying to correct her, but me doesn't take correction on things she's decided." "I don't mind it," he said. "I know," she said. She went back to the boarding house, and the town continued to talk, and the territorial court replied to Holloway's wire with the information that Ira Trask's cooperation was considered substantial, and that the recommended disposition of his case would be a fine, a formal record, and 18 months of supervised presence in the county, which in practical terms meant he was not going anywhere, but he was also not going to jail. And when Holloway told him this, Ira sat with it for a moment and then said, "That's fair," in a tone that suggested he had been prepared for considerably worse. He was back at the livery stable by Monday afternoon. Old Hennessy, who owned the place and was a practical man who cared about horses first and everything else second, had kept his bunk for him on the grounds that Trask was the best man he'd ever had with a difficult animal, and he wasn't going to let the legal situation of the territorial court interfere with good horse management. Ira came back and fed the horses and mucked the stalls, and in the evening sat on the fence of the paddock watching the sky go from orange to purple, and felt something he hadn't felt in years, possibly ever, which was something very close to peace. Me came on Tuesday with a new drawing. This one was clearly a horse, he was fairly sure, though it had an unusual number of legs. He studied it seriously and told her it was very good, and she nodded as if this were expected, and then sat down next to him on the fence and swung her feet and said, "Are you in trouble?" "A little bit," he said, "but it's getting sorted out." "Clara said you told on the bad men," Me said. "Something like that." "Was it scary?" he considered. "No," he said. It was easier than I thought it would be. Sometimes the right thing is easier than you expect. Me swung her feet a few more times. Mama cried, she said, yesterday, but she didn't know I saw. He didn't respond to that right away. He looked at the drawing of the horse with the extra legs. Your mama is a strong woman, he said finally. She is, me agreed with 4-year-old authority. She doesn't cry very often, only sometimes when she thinks we're asleep. He folded the drawing very carefully and put it in his shirt pocket. You should probably get back, he said. Does she know you're here? Me's expression was beautifully, transparently unconvincing. He walked her back to the boarding house himself. Georgia was on the front steps when they came up the street, and she had that expression again, the one that was equal parts exasperation and something softer underneath. Me, she said, and then looked up at Ira. I'm sorry. Don't be, he said. He paused. He had a thing he wanted to say, and he was working out how to say it. I was wondering, he said, if you and the girls would like to come out to the Hennessy place Sunday. He's got a new foal about a week old. Clara hasn't had much time with the horses yet. He glanced at me. And me has. Georgia looked at him. That sounds very nice, she said carefully. It's not I mean, it would just be. He started and stopped and took a breath. I'd like to spend some time with you, if that's something you'd want. She was quiet for a moment. The sun was going down behind the western edge of the town, and the light was the color of warm honey, and he was aware that he was standing on a boarding house step in Caldwell, Kansas, asking a widow if she'd like to visit a foal, and that this was the most important question he'd asked in 32 years. Sunday, she said, and smiled at him. It was a small smile, but it was entirely real, and he felt it like a hand placed flat against his chest. We'll be there. Sunday came with cool, clear air, and a sky the color of blue china. And Ira had the paddock gate open, and the foal's stall clean by 8 in the morning. The foal was a bay with a crooked white stripe down his nose and legs that still had the slightly uncertain quality of new legs. And when Georgia brought the girls down the lane toward the stable, the foal was in the paddock with his mother, and me made a sound that was not quite a word, just a pure sound of absolute joy, and broke away from Georgia at a run. Don't startle them. Georgia called after her, and me reduced her run to an urgent trot, and Ira opened the gate and met her and crouched down and said, quietly now, let the mama get comfortable with you first. And me went into his guidance with a trust so total it made Georgia, watching from the gate, feel something that was warm and sudden and undeniable. Clara came to stand beside her mother. She watched Ira with me for a long moment and then said quietly, he's patient. He is, Georgia agreed. Papa was patient, Clara said. In the careful way she said things about Tobias, measuring each word. Not the same kind, but patient. Georgia put her arm around her daughter's shoulders. Different people are patient in different ways, she said. Clara leaned against her for a moment. Then she walked through the gate into the paddock, steadily and deliberately, and went to stand beside me. And Ira glanced back and made room for her without making a thing of it. Just shifted naturally to include her, and Clara looked at the foal with her serious eyes and put out her hand the way she'd learned to do with Dolly, and the foal stretched his nose toward her, and Clara's face, just for a moment, lost its solemnity entirely. Georgia stood at the gate and watched this, and felt her chest crack open in the best possible way. Later Ira made coffee over the small stove in the back of the stable, and they sat on overturned crates in the golden fall air that came through the open stable door, and the girls were in the paddock where they could be seen through the door, and they talked. They talked for 2 hours. They talked about Missouri and Kansas, and the differences between them, about what Georgia wanted for her girls in terms of schooling, about whether Caldwell was going to grow or shrink over the next decade as the cattle trade shifted, about Tobias, and what grief felt like from the inside of it, about the Danner gang and what 15 years of that life had felt like from the inside of it. They spoke honestly, both of them, without performing anything. He told her about the Wichita bank clerk, the 16-year-old he'd talked Danner out of shooting. She listened without interrupting. That was who you were, she said when he finished. Even then. I should have gotten out then, he said. Maybe, she said, but you didn't have a reason to yet. She paused. People need reasons. He looked at her. She looked back at him. The air between them was full of October and the smell of horses and coffee and something that neither of them said out loud yet but both of them felt. I have reasons now, he said. She looked down at her coffee cup, a very small smile. I noticed, she said. He walked them back to town in the afternoon, me on his shoulders because her legs were tired, and she had announced this without apology, and Clara walking between him and Georgia with her hand tucked into her mother's. They walked slowly because the day was beautiful and no one was in a hurry, and when they came to the boarding house he lifted me down and she grabbed him around the neck for a moment before letting go and ran inside, and Clara said, "Thank you for showing us the foal," with great seriousness, and went in after her sister. Georgia stood on the step. The street was quiet in the late afternoon. I had a very good day, she said. So did I, he said. She looked at him for a moment. Ira, she said, and then stopped. Yes, he said. She shook her head slightly, a small self-correcting gesture. Nothing, I'll see you soon. He was halfway down the street before she called after him. He turned. She was still on the step, her hands folded in front of her, the sun in her hair. Thank you, she said, for what you did, for coming in. I know it wasn't simple. He stood in the street and looked at her. It was the simplest thing I've done in years, he said, and meant it. The weeks that followed had a particular quality that Ira would think about for the rest of his life, the quality of a season turning, of things going from one state to another so gradually that you couldn't name the exact moment but only the before and after. The before was a man who kept his head down and wanted nothing. The after was something else entirely. He saw Georgia regularly now, and it was understood in the way of a small town that they were in each other's orbit. She was working at the dry goods store 3 days a week, Ruth's husband Peter having helped her secure the position, and she was also involved in the effort to push the town council toward funding a proper schoolhouse, which effort she was conducting with a focused efficiency that impressed everyone who encountered it. She brought a petition to 3 town meetings in October and November, and made her case each time with a clarity and a calm that had the council members nodding despite themselves. And at the 3rd meeting Ira was in the back of the room, and he watched her stand up in front of those men and make her argument, and he felt something that was specifically and unmistakably pride, which was a feeling he had no particular right to and felt anyway. She saw him after the 3rd meeting in the lamplit street outside, and he said, "You're going to get your schoolhouse." And she said, "Of course I am," and then laughed at herself. "I don't mean to sound arrogant." "You don't," he said. "You sound like someone who knows what she's doing." They walked back through the town together, not quite side by side, close enough that when she stepped over a rough patch in the boardwalk their arms brushed, and neither of them moved away. "May I walk with you on Sunday?" he asked. Not to the livery, not about the girls, just plainly. She turned and looked at him directly in the dark with the lamplight catching the edges of her face. "I'd like that," she said. The Sunday walks became a regular thing, and then the Tuesday and Thursday evenings became a regular thing. Him coming by the boarding house after supper while the girls were being settled, and he and Georgia sitting on the porch in the cooling air and talking. Always talking about everything, about nothing, about the world and what to make of it. He learned that she read widely and thought carefully, and had opinions about things that she did not volunteer until she trusted you enough to share them. And when she trusted you enough, she shared them with a directness that he found intoxicating. He told her once that she said things that made him think about them for days afterward, and she turned pink and told him that was an extremely flattering thing to say, and he said he was only stating a fact. And she told him he could state that particular fact again any time he liked. And then they both looked at the street and did not look at each other for a moment, and it was the most charged silence he could remember being inside. Clara came to terms with him in the way that careful children come to terms with new things, which is gradually and on their own schedule, and in ways that you only recognize in retrospect. One evening in November, she came out onto the porch where he and Georgia were talking and sat down on the steps with her lighthouse book and read quietly for half an hour, not joining the conversation but not absenting herself from it either. And when she went back inside, she said good night to both of them equally, and Georgia caught Ira's eye over her daughter's head, and something passed between them that was warm and careful and full. Me had no gradual process. Me had adopted him fully from the moment of the first horse visit and conducted herself accordingly. She called him Ira now, having been corrected multiple times from horseman, and she told him things at length and without concern for whether they were relevant. He listened to all of it. He listened to a 20-minute account of a disagreement with a girl at the market about the correct color of a cat, and he listened to a detailed description of a dream Me had had about a river made of something she could not identify but believed might be honey. And he listened to Me's complete and unedited opinion of the boarding house's Thursday soup, which was negative. He listened to all of it with the same steady attention he gave everything, and Me bloomed under it the way children bloom under being genuinely listened to. And Georgia, watching from across rooms or yards or the width of a porch, felt something building in her that she had thought, after Tobias, that she might not be able to feel again. It was in November, a cool gray afternoon with the smell of coming snow on the air, when she understood fully what she was feeling. She was at the dry goods store, counting inventory, and she was thinking about a conversation she'd had with Ira the previous evening about whether to write to a publisher in Missouri who might be interested in supplying books for the potential school. And she was thinking about the way his face looked when he was engaged with an idea that interested him, how the habitual reserve dropped away, and he leaned forward slightly, and his eyes went more alive, and she was thinking about the sound of his voice saying her name, which he said carefully, and with a specific quality of attention that always made her feel as though the saying of it mattered to him. She was standing in the middle of the dry goods store with a ledger book in her hand, thinking about Ira Trask, and she understood. She set the ledger down. She finished her shift. She went home and helped the girls with their supper and put Me to bed, which involved 3 stories and 1 negotiation about whether Me could sleep with her boots on, which she could not. She helped Clara, who had developed a habit of reading with a small stub of candle until she fell asleep, and she made sure the candle was safely snuffed. And then she sat at the small table in the room she shared with her girls, and she thought about it clearly and honestly, in the way she did with everything. She was in love with Ira Trask. That was the fact of it. The second fact was that she believed he was in love with her, and had been for longer than he'd admitted to himself, possibly since before she'd fully understood her own feelings. The third fact was that he was not going to say so without some indication from her, because he was a careful man who understood the particular caution required by a woman in her position, a widow with children, who needed to be sure before she moved toward anything. She made her decision in the quiet of that November night, and it felt like the most natural thing she had ever done. The following Sunday on their walk she waited until they'd reached the edge of town where the road went out toward the open prairie and the sky was enormous and the grass was pale gold with the late season, and then she stopped walking. He stopped too and turned to look at her. "I want to tell you something," she said. "All right," he said. "I'm not very good at talking around things," she said. "I find it exhausting and inefficient, so I'm going to say it directly." He waited. His eyes on her were very steady. "I have feelings for you," she said, "real ones. I think you have feelings for me as well, but I didn't want to wait for you to arrive at saying so on your own timeline because I'm not a patient woman when I've made up my mind about something." He was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved through the grass and the sky was a deep and boundless blue above them. "No," he said, "you're not a patient woman." His voice was different, softer. "You're right about both things." "Then say so," she said. "I love you," he said, as plainly as that. The way he said most things, quietly and directly, without decoration. "I have for a while. I didn't think I had any right to." "You have a right to," she said. "Georgia." "Yes." "May I?" he started, and she crossed the small distance between them and took his face in her hands and kissed him, because she had decided, and she was not a patient woman. He went very still for one breath, and then his hands came up to hold her, carefully and completely, and he kissed her back with an honesty that matched everything else about him. And the prairie wind moved around them, and the sky was endless above them, and it was November in Kansas, and it was the best moment of her life since her daughters were born, and possibly, she thought, it was simply the best moment. When they drew apart, she kept her hands on either side of his face and looked at him. He looked back at her. He was, she realized, slightly overwhelmed, which was a thing she loved about him, that underneath all that steadiness there were things that moved him, genuinely moved him. "I love you too," she said. "I wanted you to know that I know what I'm saying when I say it. I've thought about it carefully." He turned his face slightly to press a kiss to her palm. "I know you have," he said. "That's one of the things." He stopped. "One of the things you love about me," she said. "Yes," he said. She lowered her hands but stayed close. "We should probably talk about what this means," she said. "Given your supervised residency and the girls and the fact that the whole town is watching everything we do." "The whole town was doing that before we gave them any reason," he said, and she laughed. "True," she said. "All right, later, let's walk." They walked, and they talked, and they held the fact of what they'd said between them with a kind of care and pleasure. And when they came back to the boarding house, he stood on the step, and she stood on the step, and he kissed her again, briefly and seriously, in the full view of the street. And old Mrs. Adelia Bright, who was watching from the window of the parlor, said later that it was the most dignified public display of romantic feeling she had seen in 30 years in a frontier town, which she meant as the highest possible compliment. Me found out the following Tuesday, as me found out most things, which was immediately. She marched up to Ira when he came to the door and said, with no preamble, "Mama said you are her special friend now." She examined him carefully. "You are also my special friend." "That's right," he said. "Me seemed to find this entirely satisfactory." "Good," she said. "Come see what I drew." Clara took longer, which was right for Clara. She watched, the way she always watched, from her careful remove, through a week of Ira coming for supper twice and walking with them to church on Sunday, and helping me with a kite on a windy afternoon when the string got tangled, and he sat in the dust with her and worked it out with patient hands while me narrated the whole process as if he might not notice what he was doing. Clara came to find him on a Thursday afternoon at the livery. She walked in by herself and stood in the doorway in that deliberate way and said, "May I see Dolly?" "Of course," he said, and brought Dolly out and stood back. Clara stroked Dolly's nose for a while in silence. Then she said, without looking at him, "Do you love my mother?" "Yes," he said. "She loves you too," Clara said. "I can tell she's different, lighter." She paused. "She was very sad for a long time after Papa, not always on the outside, but I could tell. She had a lot on her shoulders," Ira said. "Yes," Clara said. She looked at him now. "I don't want her to be sad anymore." "I don't either," he said. Clara held his gaze with Tobias's eyes, because me had Georgia's eyes and Clara had Tobias's, and it struck him sometimes that Georgia was raising these two pieces of a man who had loved her, and what a full and human thing that was. "All right," Clara said. "That's what I wanted to know." She stroked Dolly once more and walked back out into the sun, and Ira stood in the stable with the warm smell of horse around him, and understood that he had just been given something immeasurably important. He went to Holloway's office that same week and had a frank conversation about his situation. The territorial court's formal ruling had come through. The fine was paid from what he had in savings, which was enough but left him with less than he'd have liked. The 18 months of county residency posed no problem since he had no desire to go anywhere. His record would reflect his cooperation and his clear history of nonviolence, and Holloway had gone on record personally with the territorial court in support of Ira's good conduct since arriving in Caldwell. "You're not in bad shape," Holloway said, leaning back in his chair. "You've got work. You've got a reputation in this town that's, frankly, better than a lot of men who never did anything wrong in their lives." "I did things wrong," Ira said. "You came clean," Holloway said. "People here respect that more than you might expect." He asked Holloway something else at the end of the conversation, something he'd been working up to for a week. Holloway looked at him across the desk, and the corner of his mouth moved very slightly. "I think," Holloway said, "that you should ask her, not me. But for what it's worth, Trask, yes. I think it's a fine idea." He asked Georgia on a Saturday in December, with the first snow of the season coming down in small, dry flakes that caught in her hair, in the narrow side yard of the boarding house where they had a habit of talking when the porch was too cold and the indoors was too full of other people's attention. He did not have a ring yet because rings required careful consideration, and he hadn't been certain enough, until very recently, that this moment was going to come. But he said all of it anyway, everything he meant, which took some time because he meant a great deal. He said that he knew his past was complicated and that he would never ask her to pretend it wasn't. He said that he understood she came to this with her daughters, and that her daughters were not complicating factors, but were, in fact, some of the primary reasons he was standing here in the snow asking this question, because he had already decided that if she would have him, he would be a father to them in every way he knew how. He said that he thought she was the most remarkable woman he had ever encountered, and that he was aware that this was a large claim, but he meant it specifically and not generally. Not her beauty, though she was beautiful, but her particular way of being in the world, the way she thought and spoke and loved and fought for things, and that he wanted to spend the rest of his life being adjacent to that way of being, if she would allow it. Georgia listened to all of this standing in the snow with her arms crossed, and her green eyes on his face with an attention that he found, by turns, steadying and undoing. When he finished, she said, "You are going to make the most extraordinary father," and her voice was slightly unsteady at the end of it, which was not something he was accustomed to hearing from her. "Is that a yes?" he asked. "Yes," she said, with a sound that was half laugh and half something else. "Yes, that is very much a yes." He kissed her in the snow. She put her arms around him and kissed him back. The snow came down around them, and the side yard of the Caldwell boarding house was, in that moment, the whole of the world. They told the girls at supper that evening. Me listened to the explanation Georgia gave with an expression of growing satisfaction and then said, "So Ira lives with us." And Georgia said, "After we're married, yes." And me said, "Good," and went back to her supper with the air of someone who has had a hypothesis confirmed. Clara sat quietly for a moment and then looked at Ira across the table and said, "You'll be our father." And Ira said, "If you'd like me to be." And Clara thought about it with that serious face and then nodded once with a gravity that made his chest ache. "I'd like that," Clara said. They were married in the Caldwell church on a clear January day in 1879, with Ruth and Peter Colley standing as witnesses, and me as an unofficial participant in everything, including an attempt to also stand as a witness that was gently redirected by the minister, and Clara in a dress that Georgia had made for her from a length of pale blue cotton, holding a small bunch of dried wildflowers that she presented to Georgia with ceremonial seriousness before the service began. The church was full, which surprised Ira. He had not thought the town would turn out for him specifically. But Caldwell was there, Hennessy from the livery, the women from the church social, the men from the council, even old Mrs. Bright, who had come in her best bonnet and was weeping cheerfully from the second pew. Holloway was in the back row with his hat in his hands. Ira had not been a sentimental man, but he stood at the front of that church and watched Georgia come down the aisle with her daughters beside her and the January light coming through the windows, and he was moved in a way that was total and unfightable, and he did not try to fight it. She came to stand beside him and they looked at each other, and she said, quietly, under the minister's preliminary words, "You're all right." "Better than I've ever been," he said. She took his hand. They were married. The spring of 1879 was busy and good. Ira continued at the livery, which Hennessy, in recognition of his value and also his new family responsibilities, was making noises about eventually handing over partially to Ira's management, which was a conversation they were having slowly and in the Kansas way, which is to say indirectly and over many cups of bad coffee. Ira and Georgia found a small house on the eastern edge of town, a two-room place with a good stove and a yard, and they made it theirs over the course of March, with Georgia and her particular domestic efficiency making a home out of it with satisfying speed. Curtains at the windows and hooks on the walls, and a kitchen garden started in the yard before the last frost was properly done. The schoolhouse came through in April. Georgia had won her campaign at the February Town Council, meeting with a combination of precise financial argument and moral clarity that had left the council with essentially no grounds for refusal. And the building went up in March, and the teacher arrived from Wichita in late April. And on the first day of the school term, Georgia walked Clara to the door of the schoolhouse with me on her hip and Ira at her side. And Clara walked in with her lighthouse book under her arm and her small shoulders set with an excitement that she was working very hard to express as composure. And Georgia watched her go and then turned her face into Ira's shoulder for just a moment, and he held her thereon. The muddy street in front of the schoolhouse that she had made happen, and she straightened up and looked at him and said, "She's going to be fine. She's going to be extraordinary," he said. "Yes," Georgia said, "she is." Me would not be of school age for another year, and she was entirely clear about her feelings on this injustice. But she adapted, the way me adapted to everything, by filling the time with maximum activity and conversation and horse visits, which had become a standing part of the family's weekly life. She and Ira had a particular ritual of the Saturday morning stable visit, during which me provided detailed commentary on every horse, their moods, their qualities, their comparative attractiveness, and Ira listened with his full attention, and Clara sometimes came too, and sometimes it was just me and Ira, and on those mornings Georgia did things she didn't often get to do alone, like read or sit quietly with coffee and watch the yard and feel the particular piece of a life that had found its shape. The summer of 1879 was hot and dry in the way of Kansas summers, and the cattle drives came through again and Caldwell buzzed with activity, and Ira was busy at the livery 7 days a week, and Georgia was busy at the store and with the girls and with a new project, which was a lending library she was organizing with Mrs. Bright and 2 other women, using a back room at the church. They collected books through correspondence and donation, and one remarkable box that arrived from a Missouri publisher who turned out to have read Georgia's letter and been sufficiently impressed to send 30 volumes. Clara curated them with proprietorial seriousness and helped organize the lending system, and Ira built shelves for the back room on 2 successive Saturdays, and me helped by handing him nails and providing encouragement, and afterward Georgia brought them all lemonade, and they sat on the church steps in the late summer heat, and Ira looked at the 3 of them and felt the steady, uncomplicated fullness of contentment in a way he had not believed was available to him. There were still nights when the past came. He had been honest with Georgia about that before they married, that there were things he'd seen and been part of that didn't leave a man clean in his sleep, and she had said she understood, and she did. In the practical way she understood most things. On those nights she was simply there, warm and present beside him, and that was enough because it was always enough, her realness next to him, the specific and particular fact of her. Chester Danner was tried in the territorial court in Wichita in the summer of 1879 on charges that included robbery, conspiracy, and the deaths in Dodge City, among others. He received a sentence of 15 years, which was justice, if not the full measure of it. 2 of his men received lesser sentences. Cole and Purdy, who had been in Caldwell in October, were among those convicted. When Holloway told Ira the outcome, Ira nodded and was quiet for a moment and then said, "Good," in the same tone Georgia had used, and Holloway thought that they were well matched, those 2, in the particular way of people who cut straight to the thing. In the fall of 1879, Georgia told Ira she was expecting. She told him on a Tuesday evening in October, a year almost exactly from when he had walked into the Marshal's office, and she did it simply, the way she did everything, sitting across the kitchen table from him after the girls were in bed, with her hands folded on the table and that direct green gaze. He was quiet for a moment. Then he stood up and came around the table and crouched beside her chair and took her hands and held them very carefully, as if they were something precious, which they were. "Are you well?" he said. "Entirely," she said, "healthy and sure." "Georgia," he looked up at her. He was not a man who cried easily, but there was something happening behind his eyes that was adjacent to it. "Georgia, I don't have words for you. Don't need words," she said and put her hand against his face. "You have me, that's enough." He pressed his forehead against their joined hands. "I'm going to be a good father to this child," he said. "I'm going to be the best father I know how to be." "You already are," she said simply. "You have been since the day Clara said yes." They told the girls at breakfast the next morning. Me received the news with immediate and comprehensive enthusiasm, declaring at once that the baby would be her best friend and would need to be told about horses from a very young age. Clara asked several precise questions about timing and logistics, which Georgia answered carefully, and then Clara said, "I hope it's a boy," with a gravity that suggested she had thought about this before. "I think a brother would be interesting," she added. "We'll see what comes," Georgia said. "Either way is interesting," Ira said, and me nodded vigorously as if this were the most profound thing she'd heard all week. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was the winter of the house growing. Ira added a room to the east side of the house himself, with Peter Colley's help on the weekends, learning as he went in the way of a man who is good with his hands and willing to make mistakes and correct them. Georgia watched the room take shape with a satisfaction that was domestic and deep, and she kept Clara supplied with books from the lending library, and me supplied with horse visits and herself supplied with the specific pleasure of watching Ira build something with his hands that was for their children. The baby came in June of 1880, and it was, in fact, a boy. 8 pounds and immediately loud, with dark hair like his father and George's green eyes already promising themselves in the dark iris, and me burst into tears of joy when she was allowed to see him, which was a surprise to everyone including me, and Clara held him in both arms with a care and a seriousness that was so entirely herself that Ira had to look at the ceiling for a moment. They named him John Samuel Trask, Samuel for George's father, and he was, from his first day in the world, a person of strong opinions and considerable volume, which Georgia said meant he was going to fit right in. Caldwell grew. The schoolhouse was expanded the following autumn to accommodate more pupils, and Clara moved through it at a pace that was something remarkable, with a particular gift for mathematics and an equal dedication to literature. By 1882, she was the oldest student in the school, and the teacher, Miss Hartley, had told Georgia privately that Clara was going to outgrow what the school could offer, and that if there was any way to get her to a proper academy in Wichita or even further east, she ought to consider it. Georgia put that away to think about carefully, because it was 4 years away at least, and she didn't like to do things without thinking. Me started school and was immediately everyone's favorite, which surprised no one. She was sunny and inexhaustible and had a gift for making people feel included, and she was, Ira thought privately, going to be very formidable when she grew up, because she had her mother's determination under all that warmth. John grew fast and sturdy, and with a particular devotion to the horses that made Ira's chest go warm every time he saw it. And by the time John was 2, he was toddling at Ira's heels on stable visits, and putting his small round hands on every horse he could reach, and saying their names with the focus of a scholar learning a language. In the spring of 1882, Georgia told Ira she was expecting again. This time she told him in the kitchen garden, where they had been working in the early evening, and she said it with her hands dirty from the earth and a quality in her face that was happy and easy and certain. He pulled her into his arms right there among the seedlings and held her, and she laughed into his shoulder and said, "We're getting garden on everything," and he said, "I don't care," and held her tighter. They had a daughter in November of 1882, small and fierce and black-haired like her brother, and they named her Lily Georgia, and me fell completely in love with her within approximately 45 seconds of meeting her. And Clara held her with the same careful arms she'd held John and looked up at Georgia and said, "She's going to be a handful," and Georgia said, "Good. The world needs more handfuls." And Ira looked at the four of them around the bed in the lamplight and felt the entirety of what his life had become, the full and specific weight of it, all the people in this room who were his, and he was not ashamed of the tears that came because he was a man who had learned, with George's patient and unsentimental guidance, that certain things are worth feeling fully. Clara got her academy in the fall of 1884 when she was 12. It was in Wichita, run by women who took girls seriously, and Georgia and Ira made the trip with her to get her settled, just the two of them, Ruth and Peter keeping the younger children. The ride to Wichita was long, and Clara was quiet with a mixture of excitement and the beginning of nervousness she was working to contain, and Georgia let her be quiet and Ira did too. And when they arrived and got Clara into her room and she stood in it with her lighthouse book under her arm and looked out the window at the city, and then turned around and looked at her mother and her father, and she did call him that now, had been calling him that for years, in the same deliberate way she did everything. She had made her decision and she kept it. She looked at her parents and said, with the composure cracking just slightly at the edges, "I'll write every week." "Every week," Georgia agreed. Clara hugged her mother hard and then she hugged Ira, and Ira held her and said quietly just for her, "You are going to do extraordinary things, Clara," and she pulled back and looked at him and nodded once with the gravity that was entirely her own. The ride back to Caldwell was quiet for the first hour, and then Georgia put her hand through Ira's arm and said, "She's going to be all right, isn't she?" "Better than all right," he said. "I know," Georgia said. "I know she is. I just needed to hear you say it." He covered her hand with his. "Better than all right," he said again, with conviction. She leaned her head on his shoulder for the rest of the ride. Caldwell in 1884 was not what it had been in 1878. The cattle drives were already beginning to shift north and west, following the railroad lines that were spreading across the territory, and the town was going through the particular adjustment of a frontier community that has to decide what it is when the boom quiets. Some places collapsed. Caldwell was deciding to persist because it had the infrastructure now, the school, the lending library, the established farms and businesses, the people who had put down roots deep enough to hold through the change. Ira had taken over the management of the Hennessy livery in 1882 when old Hennessy's hands got bad enough that he couldn't do it himself, and the arrangement was a good one, Hennessy staying on in an advisory capacity and in exchange for a share, which suited both of them. Ira had an instinct for the business side of it that he hadn't known he possessed, a capability for organization and forward planning that had probably been there all along, channeled into things that didn't deserve it, and now found its proper direction. He expanded the livery in 1883 to add a second paddock and a proper farriery section, and by 1884 he was employing 2 men and training a third. Me, who at 10 years old had decided she was going to be a horse trainer when she grew up and announced this at the dinner table with complete confidence, spent every afternoon she could at the stable, and was already the best young rider Ira had seen, which he told her without exaggeration, because she had enough sense to know the difference. Georgia ran the lending library as its primary organizer and also began writing a column for the Caldwell Post, the town's small newspaper, which had started up in 1881. The column was about practical matters, education, civic planning, the development of frontier communities, and it was read widely and occasionally reprinted in the Wichita Eagle, which delighted the editor of the Post enormously and delighted Georgia privately, though she did not make a great deal of it. She was reading Ira one of her drafts one evening, sitting by the stove in the November cold, while John was asleep and Lily was asleep and the house was quiet, and she read it straight through and then looked up and said, "Well," the way she always did, expecting honesty and meaning it. "Read the third paragraph again," he said. She did. "What about it?" "You're not saying what you mean," he said. "You're going around it. You do that sometimes when you're being careful about what the editor will print, but you know what you mean. Say it directly." She looked at him. Then she looked at the page. Then she rewrote the paragraph in her head and read the new version aloud, and it was sharper and truer, and she said, "You are going to make me a better writer." "You made yourself," he said. "I just sat here." "You never just sit anywhere," she said. "You always pay attention. That's not a small thing." He looked at her over the lamplight. This woman who had turned his whole life around by existing in it, by saying, "I believe you," by coming to the Marshal's office with her hands folded and her green eyes direct, by standing on a boarding house step and calling after him on a November afternoon to say thank you for a thing that had cost him everything and given him everything. And she was looking back at him with the same attention she always gave, the same fullness of seeing. And he thought that this was what a life was supposed to feel like, this being seen, this being known, this specific weight of love that you carried not as a burden but as ballast, that kept you steady when everything else moved. He got up from his chair and went and sat beside her on the bench at the table and kissed her temple and then her cheek, and then, when she turned her face, her mouth, and she kissed him back with the same warmth and sureness she had kissed him the first time on that windy November prairie. And then she rested her head on his shoulder and looked at the unfinished column and said, "Third paragraph, all right." "Third paragraph," he agreed. Clara wrote, as she had promised, every week. Her letters were long and precise and funny, which was a quality of hers that had come out more in writing than in speech. And they read them at the dinner table, all of them, because the children loved hearing about Clara's life in Wichita with its different people and streets, and she was a vivid enough writer that they could picture all of it. Me composed her own letters in return with considerably less precision but enormous feeling, and Georgia edited them lightly and sent them with John's drawings tucked inside. And Lily, when she was old enough to contribute, added things that were not quite words yet but that were folded in anyway. Clara came home for Christmas in 1884 and was taller and looked somehow older in a way that was internal rather than physical, as if she had expanded to contain more of herself. She sat at the dinner table on her first evening home and looked around at the family and said, with an expression that was entirely and purely content, "Nothing here ever changes." "Everything here changes," me objected. "Nothing that matters," Clara said, and meant it. Georgia and Ira exchanged a look across the table that contained approximately 17 different things, including gratitude and humor and a profound and private warmth, and me said, "What?" At the look, the way she always did, and John said, "They do that," meaning the look, and Lily, who was 2 and had an opinion about everything, said something emphatic and completely unintelligible that everyone at the table treated as deeply meaningful, which it was. By 1886, Ira's 18 months of supervised county residency were long past history, a formal legal technicality that had dissolved in the daily life of a man who had not gone anywhere and had no intention of going anywhere. Danner was still in the territorial prison in Leavenworth and would be for another decade. The men who had ridden with Danner were scattered, some in prison, some dead, some having made the same turn Ira had made and finding different lives. It was a part of his history, sealed and documented and past, and what lay forward from it was what mattered. In the summer of 1886, on a warm July evening, Georgia and Ira sat on the porch of their house on the eastern edge of Caldwell, which had grown beyond its original 2 rooms to include a proper second floor and a covered porch front and back. The children were inside. John was 8 and self-sufficient in the evenings, and me was 12 and functionally a third parent, and Lily was 5 and had recently discovered the concept of secrets, which she kept urgently and incompletely. Clara was in Wichita in her 3rd year at the academy, writing letters that the editor of the Wichita Eagle had started to mention when he reprinted things, which Georgia had thoughts about. The prairie evening came down around them in shades of amber and rose, and the air was warm and smelled of grass and the particular dryness of a Kansas summer, and the sounds from inside the house were ordinary and good. John's voice, me's answering, a clatter from the kitchen. "I want to tell you something," Ira said. She turned and looked at him with the smile she always had when he used those words, which were her words from that November field, and he'd borrowed them without apology. "I'm listening," she said. "I was thinking about 8 years ago," he said, "about walking into that office with my hands up. What about it? I was thinking that I didn't fully understand at the time what I was walking toward," he said. "I knew what I was walking away from. I knew I wanted you to be safe, and I knew I was done with the life I'd had. But I didn't know, I couldn't have imagined." He stopped and started again. "Clara and me and John and Lily and this house and you. I didn't know I could have this. I'd stopped thinking it was possible." Georgia was quiet for a moment, looking at the prairie light. Then she said, "I didn't know either, after Tobias. I thought I was just building something functional, something safe for the girls. I didn't think I was going to love someone again." She paused. "I was wrong." "I'm glad you were wrong," he said. "I'm glad I was wrong too," she said, and turned toward him, and he turned toward her, and they sat close together on the porch of their house in the Kansas evening, his arm around her, her head on his shoulder, with the sounds of their children inside and the whole wide sky above and the life they had made between them solid and breathing all around. And it was enough. It was so very much more than enough. It was everything. In 1887, Clara finished at the academy with honors and came home in June with a scholarship letter to a women's college in St. Louis, and an expression that was trying very hard to conceal how much it wanted to be pure joy. She stood in the kitchen with the letter in her hand, and Georgia read it and then looked up at her daughter, who was 15 now and tall and exactly herself, more herself than she'd ever been, and said, "Clara." "I know it's far," Clara said. "I know it costs." "When do they need to know by?" Georgia said. Clara blinked. "September." Georgia handed the letter to Ira, who read it with care and then looked up at Clara and said, "This is because of who you are, Clara. You did this." Clara's composure lasted approximately 3 more seconds, and then she sat down at the kitchen table and put her face in her hands and cried, which was something she almost never did. And Georgia sat beside her and held her, and me appeared from somewhere and joined the hug without asking, and John stood in the doorway looking moved and uncertain about how to show it, the way 8-year-old boys are, and Lily climbed onto Ira's knee and looked at the whole scene with enormous eyes and said, "Why is Clara crying?" "Because she's very happy," Ira said. Lily considered this. "I cry when I'm happy sometimes," she said, which was true. "We all do," Ira said. They sent Clara to St. Louis in September of 1887, and the house was different without her, quieter in a specific way, and Georgia told Ira on the first evening after that the house had a Clara-shaped space in it now, and he said, "It'll fill in. She'll be home at Christmas," and Georgia said, "I know, it's still real," and he held her and said, "Yes, it's still real." Me turned 15 in 1889 and was already the best rider in Caldwell by general consensus, a fact that no one disputed and that me accepted with a modesty that was genuine, because she had her mother's sense of proportion under the sunshine of her manner. She had begun working formally at the livery on weekends and after school, and she had a particular talent for difficult horses, the ones that other people had given up on, the ones that needed patience and consistency, and that specific quality of presence she shared with her stepfather, that steadiness that animals responded to. John was obsessed with the mechanics of things and had taken apart and reassembled the livery's water pump twice by the time he was 9, to Ira's equal parts admiration and concern. He had the kind of mind that needed to know how things worked from the inside, and Georgia was already writing to technical academies in Kansas City and Topeka on his behalf, because that was the kind of mother she was, always looking 5 years ahead. Lily was magnificent. There was no other word. She was 7 years old and had the warmth of me and the precision of Clara and the mechanical curiosity of John, and something entirely her own that expressed itself in an absolute conviction about right and wrong that she applied to every situation without exception. She had told the butcher he was charging too much for his pork with such a clear-eyed certainty that the man had actually reduced his price. And Ira had heard this story from the butcher himself, who had told it with an expression of having been slightly outflanked and not being sure how. Georgia turned 40 in the spring of 1890 and did not make a particular event of it, but found it marked for her by her children, which is the best possible way for such things to be marked. Clara sent a long letter from St. Louis, where she was in her 3rd year and writing pieces for a city journal that were being noticed by people who noticed things. Me organized a dinner. John made something, a small mechanical box with a hinge that worked perfectly and a space inside for keepsakes, which was so exactly him that Georgia kept it on her bedside table for the rest of her life. And Lily gave her a drawing of the whole family, all 6 of them, rendered with 7-year-old accuracy and enormous feeling, labeled carefully in Lily's best handwriting, which was better than it should have been at 7. Ira gave her a book she had mentioned wanting 3 years earlier, which he had ordered from a publisher in St. Louis and had been holding for this occasion. She held it and looked up at him with an expression that he had catalogued over 12 years of marriage and still never quite got used to, because it was the expression that meant she was moved in the private way she rarely showed the world, and that she was showing it to him. "You remembered," she said. "I remember everything," he said, which was true, specifically regarding her. Everything she mentioned and meant and wanted. "I know you do," she said, and kissed him in the kitchen with the children present, which made Lily make a sound of theatrical disgust and me laugh and John disappear back outside. He pulled back and looked at her, 40 years old and extraordinary, with the lines that 12 Kansas years had added to the corners of her eyes and the silver just beginning at her temples, and the green eyes as direct and alive as they had been on a boarding house step in 1878. "Happy birthday, Georgia," he said. "It is," she said. "It very much is." The new century was still 10 years away. Caldwell was still there, smaller and steadier than its cattle boom days, a town that had found its purpose and settled into it. The lending library had become a proper town library in 1888 in its own building, with Georgia as its first formal librarian. Clara wrote from St. Louis that she had been offered a position as an editorial assistant at the journal she'd been writing for, and that she was going to take it, and that she hoped this was all right. Georgia wrote back that it was all right and that she was proud and to take every opportunity offered. Me, at 21 in 1895, was running a training operation out of the livery that had clients coming from 3 counties over. People with difficult horses who'd heard about the Trask girl from Caldwell who could bring any animal around. She was courting a young farmer named Davis Alcott from across the county line, a quiet, steady young man with kind hands and the good sense to recognize what he was looking at in me, Shepard. And Ira liked him, which mattered to me in a way she did not fully articulate but demonstrated clearly by the fact that the first thing she'd done when it got serious was bring Davis to the livery and watch Ira and Davis talk about horses. John went to a technical school in Topeka in 1893 and came back in 1895 with a certification in mechanical engineering and a plan to start a small machine repair shop in Caldwell because the town needed one and he was the person to do it. He was 17 and precise and good, and Georgia told Ira privately that she could see John at 50, distinguished and useful, and Ira said he thought the same. Lily, at 12 in 1892, had written a letter to the Caldwell Post about the conditions of the school's outhouses, which had been published, which had resulted in new outhouses, which had made Lily's reputation as a person not to cross in civic matters. Georgia had read the letter before it was sent and made 3 suggestions, all of which Lily had accepted with a graciousness that suggested she knew when advice was worth taking. In the autumn of 1895, Clara came home from St. Louis for the first time in 2 years, which was longer than anyone had liked, but which was the reality of a life built in another city. She came home taller seeming, though she was the same height, carrying herself differently, with the ease of someone who has become fully what they were always going to be. She was 23 years old and had published pieces in 2 national journals, and was, as the St. Louis editor had told her directly, one of the sharpest minds in the building. She sat at the Trask kitchen table on her second evening home and looked at Ira across the table with those dark eyes that were still Tobias's eyes in shape, but that had become entirely their own thing in expression, and she said, "I want to tell you something." He looked up. "I've been thinking about this for a while," she said, "about what to say, and I decided that I would say it directly because that's what this family does." She glanced at Georgia, who was listening with complete stillness. "I have been very lucky," Clara said with precision, "in ways that I didn't understand when I was young but that I understand now. You both," she paused, "what you made here. What you are to each other and to us. I grew up inside something real, not everyone does, and I know who I am because of it, both of you." She looked at Ira. "You were my father," she said. "In every way that mattered. I want you to know that I have always known that." The kitchen was very quiet. George's hand was over her mouth. Ira sat for a moment with what Clara had just given him, and he thought about a girl who had come into a livery stable with a deliberate step and put one finger on a horse's cheek, and he thought about a girl who had asked him plainly, "Do you love my mother?" And he thought about 20 years of her growing up, which had been the privilege he had not deserved and had been given anyway. "Clara," he said, and his voice was not entirely steady, which was all right. "Thank you." She nodded once with the precision that was all her own. Then she said, "Now, tell me about what John is building. His letter said something about a gear system and I want to understand it." And just like that they were back, the ordinary and extraordinary together, the way they always were in this kitchen, in this family, in this life. Me and Davis Alcott were married in the spring of 1896, in the same Caldwell church where Georgia and Ira had married 17 years before, and me was luminously happy. And Davis looked at her the way a man looks at a woman when he knows exactly what he has and intends to honor it. And Ira shook Davis's hand after the ceremony and said, "Take care of her." And Davis said, "Every day," and Ira believed him. They had their first child, a boy, in 1897, which made Georgia a grandmother and Ira a step-grandfather, which they discussed and agreed was not a word that meant anything relevant. And they held the baby on the same day he was born, and Georgia looked at this small person who was part of me, who was part of her, and said, "There it is," in a tone of wonder that she hadn't heard from herself in a while. "There it is," Ira agreed. Lily, at 17 in 1897, was already the person she was going to be, which was someone formidable and fair, with her mother's green eyes and her own particular fire. And she was writing her own column for the Caldwell Post, had been since she was 15. And she had plans, as Lily always had plans, clear, and several years ahead of the present. John's machine shop on the main street was doing steady business, and he had hired one man and was considering a second, and he was 20 years old and looked at ease in the life he had built himself, which was deeply satisfying to both his parents in the specific way of watching a child find their shape. The family gathered for Christmas in 1897, all of them, Clara home from St. Louis, me and Davis and the baby from across town, John from his rooms above the shop, Lily still at home. They filled the house to its edges, and the noise was extraordinary, and there was a moment after supper, when Georgia and Ira slipped out to the back porch together in the cold December night, not by plan, but by the simultaneous instinct of people who have moved together for long enough that they sometimes decide things without speaking. The stars were very clear above the Kansas plain, the way they are in December when the air is cold and dry, and the sky seems to press closer to the earth. "Listen," Georgia said, from inside, Clara's voice precise and animated, describing something to me and Davis. John's quieter voice joining, Lily's certainty cutting through, the baby's occasional announcement of his own presence. Layers of it, the specific sound of their family alive and gathered. "I hear it," Ira said. She turned and looked at him in the starlight. He was 51 years old, and the same as he had always been to her, steady and real and hers. The man who had walked into a marshal's office in 1878 with his hands in the air and his whole life changing. Who had carried her sleeping child through the October twilight. Who had built the extra room with his own hands and listened to her drafts and remembered the book and said "I love you" on a windy November prairie as simply as if it were the simplest thing, which it was, which it always had been. Underneath everything, "I love you," she said. "I love you," he said. They stood on the porch in the cold starlight, close together, warm, and the sounds of their family came through the walls of the house they had made. And it was 1897 in Caldwell, Kansas. And it was a good year, as all their years had been good in the particular way of years lived with intention and love and the willingness to be known. And it was enough, all of it, and it was everything. And it was closed around them like two hands held, like a family gathered in winter light. Like a life fully and completely and joyfully lived.